Hi guys, welcome back to my podcast. It's Leila and Sincerely Leila podcast. So today I wanted to talk with you guys about growing up poor. Like you can tell by the title of this podcast, I am really trying to become more consistent, and I think what works for me best is uploading podcasts bi-weekly, so twice a month, 1 week between each new episode. So I think it gives me time to film, edit, upload, but then also to kind of have more to talk about, because I feel like if I do this every week, I kind of don't know what to talk about. Also, today it's so hot that I left my AC on. I hope you cannot hear it. I think you cannot, but if it will so happen that you can, apologies, but it's too hot for me to not blast AC even when I'm recording this podcast. So this is episode 4. We're gonna be talking about growing up poor, and let's begin. So I know this podcast topic is very specific and it might not be understood by many of you, and I wish not, because like growing up poor really is a trauma. It's a trauma of mine, and I will try to delve deeper into what I mean by that and how it affects me today. And for that, I really feel like I need to start from the beginning. So let's just jump straight into it. I will start with the book that actually, in a way, inspired me to talk about this, but also I decided to talk about it because it's been on my mind. And if you're watching me on YouTube, if you are now watching me on YouTube, I'm holding right now Mieko Kawakami's Breasts and Eggs book that I just started. And I actually posted this page quote on my Instagram story. So if you follow me there, you already know this, you already read this, but I will read for all those who don't follow me or just missed that story. So the first chapter says, "Are you poor?" And it starts with basically the author explaining what growing up poor or being poor means. And I really feel like this represents growing up poor so well, and I never even thought about it this way. So let me just read it. "If you want to know how poor somebody was growing up, ask them how many windows they had. Don't ask what was in their fridge or in their closet. The number of windows says it all. It says everything. If they had none, or maybe 1 or 2, that's all you need to know." I remember telling this to someone once. I can't remember who it was, but she really went off on me. Come on though. What if you have 1 window, but it's huge with a garden view or something? Like one of those really nice big windows. How could that mean you're poor? But as far as I'm concerned, no one who's ever been poor could think like that. A garden view? A nice big window? Who has a garden though? And what the hell could make a window nice? For poor people, window size isn't even a concept. Nobody has a view. A window is just a blurry pane of glass hidden behind cramped plywood shelves. Who knows if the thing even opens? It's a greasy rectangle by the broken extractor fan that your family's never used and never will. You only know what it means to be poor, or have the right to talk about it, if you've been there yourself. Maybe you're poor now. Maybe you were poor in the past. I'm both. I was born poor and I'm still poor. And oh my god, I effing love this. I don't know, it made me really want to buy the book, because I think I saw it for the first time. I saw it a lot on Instagram and TikTok, and I was kind of like breasts and eggs, whatever. But then I saw this page and I was like, I need to have it. Because interestingly, I don't know if you noticed, but I feel like in my life, whenever I start realizing something, I see it more often. And yes, you can say that I just started paying attention to it, but I think it just is a sign from the universe. And when I started realizing how really affected I was by growing up poor, it really changed a lot in my head for me. I feel like I got answers to questions. And then when I meet people or I see things that speak of that experience of growing up poor and how affected we all are by that experience, I feel like this sort of connection to those people who grew up poor as well. So in a way, this is gonna be me diving deep into my childhood and like hardships. In a way, I also want to maybe try to be philosophical about it, or not even philosophical, but kind of give my unsolicited opinion on where we are now as a capitalist society in the 21st century. Anyways, so I feel like every episode of mine, I go into where I'm from, who I am. But yeah, like I grew up in Kazakhstan, you guys, and I was born in 1995, and that was pretty much like a few years after the Soviet Union collapsed. So my parents had me pretty late, especially for that part of the world. My mom gave birth to me when she was 41, and she's older than my dad. So my dad was in his early 30s. Yes, my mom is 9 years older than my dad, and I'm still learning to say it without feeling ashamed, because as a child I was ashamed, first of all, that my mom gave birth to me so late, because all of my classmates, when we were 7, 8, their parents were in their 30s and my mom was already in her 50s, and it was so shameful for me to say that my mom is 50 when all of my classmates' parents are like in their 30s. So that was my first something I was ashamed of. I don't know if it's like a complex thing or whatever, but I was ashamed of it. I was hiding that, and I was even telling my mom, it's been like 10 years since I go to school, and I keep on saying that you're 30, like it's been 10 years and you still remain 30, and it's like our inside joke. My mom always understood where this shame comes from. So like me trying to seem better, I feel like my mom really understood my psychology well enough to understand that in order to fit in, I'm hiding some things, which I'm not saying is the right thing, but I never was in trouble for that. And my parents would never be like, why are you lying? And I was like, I wouldn't say I was a liar as a child, but I was always like making up stories. I was and I think that's a big thing for poor kids. Like we are so ashamed for being poor that we a lot of times just add a few things here and there to not be odd ones out, so yeah, that was the first thing. Back to the topic. My mom being old, and then her being older than my dad, like 9 years older. It's frowned upon not just in the Eastern community, but like around the world. Like people are so okay with men being older that when a woman is older, it's like weird. But that's my parents, that's my story. And then on top of that, my parents never got married. I literally spoke about this with my therapist, and she said this is the reason why I got married so early and so fast, because I was really trying to not be like my parents, and because they never had a wedding, and I always wanted to have it because I wanted them to get married. Like that's why I really just rushed into it. And this is not to say that I regret getting married, but it's just like, if I would come from a normal family where parents were married, and I don't want to hurt anyone who are like my parents, who made their choices to not get married, but as a child who was raised by parents who never had a wedding, that affected me personally. So this is not towards anyone. If you decide to never get married, good for you. I'm not saying anything against that, but it's just like, as a child from such a family, I felt odd, and I really wanted to see my mom in a wedding dress, to have those photos, to be like, oh, this is my mom as a bride. And I don't know, for me, it was how my therapist calls it, and not just my therapist, but I'm not sure it's really common in Western psychology, but it's like Gestalt, which is something that's open in your psyche, and it's like a trauma that you need to close. And if you don't do exactly what you wanted to do and didn't get a chance to do, it will stay it will still be a Gestalt. So I actually don't know what Gestalt translates to, because I guess it's German, right? It sounds like a German word. But my therapist, she is from Ukraine, and therefore it's this post-Soviet school. So a lot of things she says I didn't read about in the Western like psychology books that I read. So I don't know how relevant this is, but a lot of the times she talks about Gestalt and all of that. Okay, so my family history. I guess we can also talk about like Gestalt some other time, but for now, this is kind of it. So yeah, growing up, that was my life. I was hiding a lot, but then on top of that, being poor, like that was additional something that made me feel so insecure. I think that people who never were really poor, they don't understand the pain of growing up poor and feeling like you're worse than your classmates, people your age. For example, I went to a school that's like a gymnasium, which means it's like, really good education school. And it was public school. It wasn't private. Like I said, I was poor. Ain't no way my parents could afford that at the time. And somehow in my class, I had a lot of kids from wealthy families. So growing up, I would see my classmates getting picked up by expensive cars, like that their parents were driving. A lot of my friends' parents were like entrepreneurs, and that was like post-Soviet Kazakhstan, so it was possible already for people to do business, and that's what a lot of people were doing. For some reason, my parents weren't that lucky. My mom had a few like businesses that she tried to open. It was always related to like restaurant business, because my mom, she studied to become a chef, so her whole life, like in Soviet times, she was running the kitchen. So when it was time for people to live in the capitalist society after communism fell apart in Kazakhstan and other Soviet countries, she, like many others, tried different things, and I was there. I saw it all. I saw my mom trying different things out, and it never really stuck, and it never really became a big thing. It was more driving us deeper in debt. So we were always in debt, and like it was something I always felt. Like it never was hidden from me. I talked to my husband, and I feel like the way he was raised and the way a lot of people probably are raised is like parents try to protect you from this information. For me, I always knew like money problems exist. One of my earliest memories is like me asking my mom to buy me a toy, and her telling me like, if I buy you this toy, we will have nothing to eat. And like that just like stuck with me, that that was my life. And then there were periods when I was a bit older, when I was already around like 13, 14, when my dad wasn't getting paid at his job. By the way, my dad was police officer, so actually like a public service worker, right? And the government wasn't paying on time. So those were the days. And yeah, like because my dad wasn't paid on time, a lot of times we had nothing to eat. So my mom would just literally like make a soup with potatoes and carrot and like throw in Maggie. I don't know like if it's a thing in other countries, but like it's, I guess, right? Like Maggie, it's like this cubicle of soup you just throw in and it gives the taste. So that was it. And like my mom would give it to me, and I was like, what the hell? Like, you want to eat and you come from school. I just remember it was such a difficult period because I was so depressed because I wasn't eating and I was like hungry. And so like when I say being poor, I don't mean just like I didn't have like, some secondary things. It was like this bad. It was to this degree. And then I think this like feeling of having to hide the reality from everyone. I never wanted people to pity me. I never wanted for people to look at me upside down. Because I was always, especially as a child, I was always like such an activist, a leader, and always super loud. Even now, like you can tell, my personality really didn't change since I was a child. Like there's just a bit more understanding in my head right now, but I'm still the same. Like, literally, my personality has not changed. And I was always bubbly. I was always like happy child. And I never wanted people to associate me with being poor, And I really don't know if people knew, because I feel like you just know when someone is poor, right? Like, but I honestly never think about it. Like, when I look at someone, I don't think like, are you poor or rich? But I feel like rich people just have this certain way. You just know when someone is rich, because they're like carefree. They're very slow in life. Like, they are not in a rush, unless of course they are hustlers and like self-made people. But when it's like generational wealth people, they are so calm. Have you noticed? And I feel like poor people just always uncomfortable. Like, and you notice it. And maybe I'm saying it because I grew up poor, so I feel it. But yeah, now let's kind of go back to the school years. Something else that was always like so difficult for me growing up is when my friends would go on vacations, and every fall when we would come back from our holidays, they would be, because I went to gymnasium, like I said, we had 3 languages from the first grade like being taught to us, and the school was Russian, but I was like learning English and Kazakh besides like classes in Russian and also Russian grammar class. And so in all 3 languages, every effing fall, I had to sit there and listen to all of my classmates share their amazing trips to Paris, to Egypt, seeing pyramids, going to Turkey, to the seaside. And you know what I did every single summer? I was sitting in my room. Actually, I didn't have a room. And we'll get to it, but we were living in a studio. Ever since I was 7, we lived in a studio apartment that I was sharing the room with my parents. I'll explain. You wait for it. And what I was doing is my parents are working always. And so in the summer, I would just be home alone and I would be watching Nickelodeon. But in the summer, they give you access to Jetix, which also before Jetix, it was called Fox Kids. So that TV channel wasn't always available in my cable TV. Like, you could pay more and get more channels, but the one we were paying for, it was without Jetix. And then like they would gift children Jetix for the summertime. And that was the highlight of my summer, just getting for free cartoons channel. Like, that was the highlight of my summer. My parents couldn't afford to take me abroad. My parents couldn't afford to go to the seaside. None of it. I flew for the first time on a plane when I was, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10, something like that. And we flew with my dad to Azerbaijan, and my mom didn't come because we couldn't afford a third ticket. So it was just me and my dad and my like cousins who also went with their dad to visit Azerbaijan. So that was the first time I flew away. That was the first time I like traveled abroad, which is like, I'm going back to my dad's home country. Like, I don't know if that's really abroad, but yeah, that was fun. We spent like 1 month there. That was fun. But then after that, we didn't travel for the next like 10 years, I think, or 7, 8 years. Like, and then the next time I traveled somewhere was again Azerbaijan. So that's like, that was my life. And then when I moved to Europe, which is another thing, right? Like, so I grew up poor. We didn't have money to travel. We didn't have money for private education. Then how come I was able to move to Europe? The good thing about life is nothing stays the same. And once my dad retired from his job, because police officers, like police workers, they go into the retirement earlier than the rest. So my dad, after retiring from his police job, he actually got another job, which is not in the police at all, but like still related to law and like security. So once he went to the private sector after retiring, that's when we started getting money. And that's when essentially it was time for me to go to university. But even during those days, in order for me to go to Malaysia, which you guys, if you didn't know, I moved to Malaysia first to study, and then I didn't like it and I went back to Kazakhstan, and I moved to Czech Republic and stayed here. But in order to send me to Malaysia, my dad sold his car and got worse car. And like, do rich people do that? No, they don't have to sell anything. They have that stability. And like, the huge reason why I was able to get my education abroad and to go to private university in Europe in English was because of my father's sacrifices. And I always specify that I'm not a trust fund baby. I don't come from a generational wealth family, and I don't come from privilege, not at all. Like, I actually come from being poor. Like, that's the fundamental truth to my being, and that's why I'm so uncomfortable with privileged people. Like, some people who have like rich families and nepo babies, like, I absolutely cannot stand them. I can never like truly bond with someone who is not in a position that I am, where I need to literally like climb my way up without anyone pushing me, anyone giving me the hand to hold. Like, everything in my life, besides my father investing in my education and moving me to Europe and paying for my first few years in Europe, like, I never had like rich parents, sugar daddies, boyfriends who would pay for me and like for my career. Like, I had none of that. So for me, when we're talking about like career and professional life, and people are so careless because they know their family will always help them, they work for family businesses, and they're good, like, I cannot bond with that. I cannot relate to your life and to your experience. So I did actually have a fallout with my friend because of that. And I just think the older you get, the more social status really influences your circle. And maybe it's coming also from my personal like insecurity as a child, being that odd child. But I think with getting older, I kind of embraced the fact that my name is Leila and I grew up poor and I don't come from privilege and I don't have anyone helping me. And I wish there were people, but there are none. So I cannot stand next to privileged people from privileged backgrounds and act like we get each other, because we don't. Because you don't know what struggle is. And don't give me this, oh, people who are from rich families and rich, they also go through. I'm not saying they don't, but I'm saying that when you come from being poor, from poverty, and you literally have stories of not having anything to eat, like, it's really difficult to listen to someone who tells you how they went to like, Switzerland for every winter break because that's what rich people do. And for them, it's nonchalant. Like, and it's not their fault that they are rich, right? And I'm not saying that. Like, it's a big deal for me that you cannot relate to my struggle if you cannot understand what it was like to come from nothing to something. And I started using Bumble BFF. I don't know if I mentioned it in one of my podcasts, probably no, but I think I wrote about it in my newsletter. So if you, by the way, are not following my newsletter, please do, because I want to write more for my community, which is you guys. So you can follow and get it straight to your email. I met one person actually two people with whom I could bond over growing up poor. And it felt so comforting. And it felt so great to feel that there's someone who went through the same thing in a different country, different parents, different, circumstances, but they understand. And I feel like growing up poor is such a universal feeling of the capitalist society of the 21st century that is a big deal for me. And I didn't know it as a child that it really matters to me. But now as an adult, I really cannot make friends with rich kids. Like, it's okay if you are now rich because you made it. But in today's economy, not many people just become rich because they made it. Oh my God, the sun is like hitting me and like making ugly stripes on me. Sorry about that if you're watching. But if you're listening, no one cares, That's what I love about Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You just listen to me, and I feel like it's more fun to listen without watching, but also sometimes I like to watch podcasts. So I'm doing both. So if you're watching me, I'm sorry, but if you're listening, sorry about interrupting my story for the visual listeners. And now let's go back to what I mentioned about growing up in a studio apartment. So when I was born, actually, we had a really nice apartment that I lived for the first 5 years in with my parents, and it was 1 bedroom, 1 living room, and kitchen, and as a 5-year-old child, I had enough space to grow up there. And then when I was 5, my parents took me to view this apartment, and we come there and I'm like, what is this? Like, it's so ugly, it's so small. And I was like, surely we're not buying this, ours is so much better. And then my parents are like, we're moving there. And I kid you not, my whole world collapsed when that happened. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, but it was just like such a big life-changing move that at the age of 5, which according to my therapist is also an important age for a child, like that changing and that not being something I'm excited about was a big deal for me. And I think that was the beginning of how I developed like the desire to control things. Like, I wouldn't say I'm a controller, but I need to be in control of things in my life. And I think this is where it's coming from, because no one gave me the heads up, no one explained to me why. It was just, we're moving, that's it. And I hated that apartment, and now as an adult I know the reason why we had to move. And this might be personal, but honestly this podcast is everything personal, so let me share it with all the random people on the internet who know me and who don't know me. My mom actually, like, remember how I was saying we were always in debt? So she took money from her sister, she gave her a loan, and then when it was time to give it back, my mom couldn't. My mom didn't tell my dad, and then my aunt told her husband, and then they went to the court, and then my mom had to pay them, and we didn't have money to pay them, and we had to sell the apartment. And that was one of a few times when my mom took money from the bank or somebody and didn't tell my dad until like people were coming and knocking on our door. And it's one of the reasons why my relationship with my mother is like so difficult for me, because I cannot forgive her for many of these stupid decisions she had, and why I'm so grateful to have a father like mine who, no matter what, he always put me first and like made sure that my life is better and easier than his, because my experience with being poor is actually like nothing compared to my dad's experience with being poor, because he literally grew up in Azerbaijan in a village, and during Soviet times when it was so much worse than it was for me. So it's just like generational poverty. There are people who have generational wealth, and I don't, because I don't come from a family like that, But then from my mom's side, they were rich before communists came. So that's kind of like, maybe if communists wouldn't come, I would be rich, because I would get that generational wealth. But no, unfortunately, I grew up poor. I really started realizing that I grew up poor only after I married my husband, and we would talk, and he would tell me how every summer he went to the seaside, how he grew up in this 2-story house where he lived only with his parents. So me and my parents, we lived in this studio apartment where we shared one room, and it was like living room, bedroom, my bedroom, their bedroom. Yeah. And that went on until my parents renovated the apartment that we were living in, and they made the kitchen into my room. So I had my own room, but it was ex-kitchen, but actually no one could tell. But yeah, that was my bedroom. So I think I was like 12 when that happened. So I lived with my parents in the same room until I was like a teenager. Thank God, because that would be really uncomfortable. But yeah, my husband literally had the whole house to himself. His mom only worked half a day, so he had his mom at home with him. He never was alone all the time. When I tell him like my stories, like, Oh yeah, like I would stay alone at home after school, like from 1 p.m. till like 10 p.m. because my parents worked that late. And he, like, I think his reaction, or like him finding it different than what he experienced, is what made me realize, like, I think I did grow up poor, you know? So I was alone all the time. I didn't travel. I never saw the world. And for me, like, moving away was such a big thing, I think, because like I said, sitting there in the classroom and listening to classmates' stories of like seeing the world, and many of them actually went to like English summer schools, you know, to learn the language. Like, that's what rich people do. I never had that either. So I guess like that's where that like crazy desire to study abroad, to live abroad came to me. Um, because I just didn't have trips. I didn't have like nice things in life. And I remember when I would share it with my father, he's like, Layla, who you are, like, look who you are and like what you're striving for, you know? Uh, this is not for us. This is not for people like you and me. And I just never agreed to limit my goals just because of today me not being rich, you know? And I'm so glad I never did. I'm so glad that like I never let my father's realism put me down, because if I wouldn't dream big, if I wouldn't believe in my skills, in myself, I would be back home now, and I don't know what I would be doing, but I think I would be pretty unhappy. And ever since I moved to Europe, like, for me, traveling is such a big part of my life. And like when we don't travel, because I married a person who is literally like almost like my father, idea of just doing things for fun doesn't really click for him. But I grew up poor, so I don't want to stay poor. You know what I mean? And it's not even about, for me, it's not about like how much money I have in my bank account. It's about the memories I make. It's about not being in that cage anymore. And like I always explain to my husband, listen, you grew up having so much in your life that I never had. So for me, now as an adult, like, traveling is so important that I explain to my husband that we literally come from different classes. And okay, maybe nowadays we're on the same level, but his childhood was so much more privileged than mine that he can never understand why it's so important for me to see the world, to travel. It's because I'm just trying to make up for all those years when I didn't travel. And I'm trying to see as many countries as possible. And that's something I'm not gonna apologize for, you know, because I think a lot of our misunderstanding comes from that he is unable to understand why I need traveling so much. So I always need to explain this whole thing. Okay, I think I'll have to wrap up the podcast because my camera is dying. I don't know what to do. I don't know. Should I pause? Should I stop? Like, should I say bye? And should we talk about it next time? Okay, guys, I literally see that my camera is dying and I need to buy new battery to not have this happen to me in the future. But I feel like I'll have to wrap it up here because it's giving me anxiety to see that flashing red thing. So in the next podcast, maybe I'll continue the story by talking about Karl Marx Communist Manifesto, and learning something about being poor and social inequality. But I think for today, that's like my story about growing up poor. If you relate to it or you don't, like, if you agree, disagree, you can share it if you're watching on YouTube, and I think on Spotify as well. You can like share what you think about this episode. Also, wherever you're listening, please do give me 5 stars to help my podcast grow, and let me know what would you like me to talk about next time. And with that being said, thank you so much for listening and watching. I'll be back soon, I promise, and I'll take care of that battery soon as well. So I love you and thank you for listening.